Have you ever walked into a room where everyone else had a seat, except you? Not because you were late, not because you lacked the credentials, but simply because they didn't think you belonged there. I know that feeling better than anyone. It's a heavy kind of silence that presses on your chest, turning every glance, every fake smile around you into a blade. As a Black CEO, I've learned to carry that wound into every room I step into. But a wound doesn't mean weakness. It's a reminder. Every time I'm pushed out, I gain another reason to build a space where no one can erase me again. Because justice isn't about begging for a seat at someone else's table. Justice is building a new table, one where our voices aren't cut off, where our ambitions aren't drowned out. And then one day, they handed me the perfect chance to prove it. They thought crossing my name off the leadership list would shut the door on me. What they didn't know was that their closed door only made me open a grander hall of my own. And the bitterest part for them? Their audience, yes, the people they thought were theirs, walked away and came to me. That's the story I'm about to tell you. A story without shouting, without chaos. Only the sharp silence of irony, cutting deep enough to flip the script, and a truth powerful enough to expose those who thought they were untouchable. If you've ever been the one pushed aside, if you believe in the strength of silent pride, hit like, share, subscribe, and turn on the notifications. Because you won't want to miss stories like this, stories where silence can become thunder. And today's journey begins with a red carpet that was never rolled out for me. I walked into the conference hall with steady steps, my suit pressed crisp, collar stiff like an invisible shield. In my hand, the invitation, thick, glossy paper, the bold letters Leadership Summit Special Panel, stamped across it like a seal of legitimacy. I wasn't just here to attend. I had a seat, a place at the table where big conversations happened. The air in the lobby was thick with expensive perfume and the rhythmic click of high heels. Red carpet stretched forward, guiding guests toward the gleaming check-in desk. I waited in line, watching the people ahead. They handed over their invitations, the staff smiled, typed a few keys, and handed back gold-lettered name tags. Simple. Smooth. Elegant. 10 seconds, I thought. My turn in 10 seconds. When I stepped up, the staff member looked up, still wearing the polite smile left over from the last guest. I placed my invitation on the desk, my voice calm and steady. Dorian Hayes. She glanced at her screen, fingers tapping quickly on the keyboard. A slight furrow in her brow, then the same polite smile returned. Sorry, sir, you're not on the list. For a second, I thought I'd misheard. I adjusted my tie, leaned in slightly, lowered my voice. Maybe you should check again. This is an official invitation. I slid the card closer. She glanced at it, shrugged. I understand, but the list is the list. Your name isn't on it. Behind me, the line kept moving. I caught the whispers, a suppressed chuckle, an impatient sigh. Someone muttered to a friend, just loud enough. Guess he thinks he's important. I took back the invitation, the thick paper suddenly feeling as fragile as a napkin. The whole hall sparkled under crystal chandeliers, but for me, all the lights seemed to converge on this one desk, this one moment, where I was erased with a few keystrokes. I looked into her eyes. They were calm, almost bored, like this happened all the time. And that's when it hit me. In places like this, discrimination rarely shouts. It doesn't break down doors, it just smiles faintly and types your name out of existence. Heat rose in my chest, but a smile tugged at my lips. Not a friendly smile, not even a conciliatory one. It was the bitter smile of someone realizing he'd been cast as the lead in a play he never auditioned for. For a moment, I considered speaking up, dropping the organizer's name, demanding answers, but then I stopped. I remembered an old lesson. When they want you gone, your silence can unsettle them more than any protest ever could. I folded the invitation neatly, slipped it back into my pocket, stepped aside for the next person in line. My feet felt heavy, but my stride didn't falter. Somewhere behind me, someone said in a voice dripping half with pity, half with disdain, "Some people just dream they belong." I didn't turn around. I let the words fall flat on the red carpet, swallowed by the chatter and the click of heels. Because right then, another thought burned through my mind. If they wouldn't let me walk their red carpet, I'd build a whole new stage outside. And when I walked across it, they'd have no choice but to watch. I gripped the invitation tighter, the thick paper stiff in my hand like proof of my legitimacy. I placed it on the desk again, pushing it toward the check-in clerk. "My name is here. The invitation is signed by the organizers. Just look again." She picked it up, eyes flicking over the print. Then, without a word, she set it down as though it were nothing but clutter. A perfunctory nod. "Sorry, sir, you're not on the list." Behind me, laughter flickered through the air, thin as a thread, sharp as a blade. A group of men in matching suits shook their heads, smirking. One leaned toward another, voice pitched just loud enough. Probably some walk-in trying to sneak in for the bragging rights. I stood there, silent. But inside me, a storm raged. The truth was bitter. They weren't just rejecting a piece of paper, they were rejecting me. In that moment, I wasn't a CEO. I was just another black man standing in the wrong place. I looked down at the invitation. The bold, special panel letters now looked like the punchline to a cruel joke. No matter how thick the paper, it wasn't heavy enough to hold me inside this room. It had been demoted to the worth of a bus ticket, refused at the door. I heard the impatient click of a woman's heels behind me, tapping out a rhythm of irritation. Arms folded, eyes rolling. No one asked who I was. No one wondered if I belonged. I pictured the scene if I shouted, "I'm a CEO, right here, right now." They'd probably laugh. Maybe someone would mockingly clap before signaling security. The night would end with me escorted out under the bright lights, their laughter echoing behind me. I chose silence. I wouldn't give them the free show. The clerk kept checking in guests, typing away as if I were invisible. But I stood tall, wearing my half-smile like armor. Because right then, I understood. This rejection wasn't the ending. It was a pause. And I would be the one to write the next act. A thought struck me. Sharp, ironic. Maybe to them, this invitation was just cheap ink on paper. Funny thing was, the man they dismissed was the one funding half the revenue they were bragging about tonight. I slipped the invitation back into my pocket, turned, and walked away. Their laughter followed me, but this time it sounded thinner. Not sharp, not victorious, just hollow. Let them laugh. Laughter dies quickly when the punchline turns on you. I left the check-in desk with my head high. They thought I was the outsider, but soon they'd realize they were the ones being left behind. I paused for a moment, breathing deep. No arguments, no explanations, no scrambling for a seat they'd already decided to withhold, because a seat given without respect isn't worth sitting in. I smiled, not warmly, not bitterly. Just a private smile, a reminder to myself, this wasn't the first door slammed in my face. Banks had denied my loan applications for being too risky. Schools had rejected my name for being unpromising. And now a conference was dismissing me for being unworthy. I stepped out of line. The red carpet beneath my feet felt less like a welcome mat and more like a velvet rope keeping people like me out. As I left, I heard the next person step forward, the line closing in as though my absence erased me completely. In my head, I laughed softly. A private, ironic laugh. They really thought crossing my name off a list meant erasing me from the room forever? That naive assumption didn't anger me anymore. It amused me. Because here's the truth. Deny me one chair and I'll build an entire table beside yours. I remembered my childhood. No one saved me a seat in the conversations that mattered. I had to stand on the edges, listening, learning, until I created conversations of my own. Isolation became my classroom, and the first lesson was this. Silence isn't surrender. Silence can be the coil before the spring snaps back. As I turned down the hallway, the chandelier light blazed behind me, but it no longer dazzled. What burned brighter was the fire in my chest, a quiet, simmering determination. They didn't know it yet, but they just handed me the raw material for the perfect response. Never beg for a seat, build the table. A table without red carpets, without gold-lettered name tags, without anyone's permission. A table where I decide who belongs. I smiled to myself as I walked on. Maybe a few people watched me leave, puzzled at the confidence in my stride. They didn't know I was already plotting a stage so grand their entire room would look small beside it. This silence, this smile, it wasn't defeat. It was the opening move in a game they didn't even know I was playing. And the question lingering in the air for anyone paying attention was this. What happens when the man denied a seat builds a table so vast that everyone else ends up fighting for a place at it? I sat in the back row, a seat they clearly thought fit me better. The ceiling lights blazed above, glittering like stars, bouncing off every polished glass, every tailored suit, every carefully styled head of hair. Everything looked flawless, except for the empty space where my seat should have been. And then he walked out. A white man, silver hair slicked back, a red tie screaming across the room like a punctuation mark. He strode to the podium, stood tall, smiling like this entire hall had been built just to glorify him. The mic caught his voice, sharp and clear. Only the truly deserving have a place here. For a moment, the room froze. Then the applause came, thunderous, relentless, like a sudden downpour, pounding a metal roof. People stood, nodding solemnly as if they'd just heard some ancient truth handed down from the heavens. I sat still, my hands resting on my thighs, feeling my pulse hammering through my veins. Eyes flicked toward me, not curious eyes, not even questioning ones, but eyes delivering a verdict, outsider. I tilted my head slightly, smothering a bitter laugh. Truly deserving? What does that even mean? A lighter skin tone than these blazing lights above us? A louder voice than this microphone can carry? Or maybe just a passport stamped with generations of power? As his speech rolled on, I felt my lips curve into a smile. Not warm, not amused, but the dry smile of someone watching an old trick dressed up as a new performance. I'd heard these words before, at school, at work, even on the streets. But hearing them again at a so-called global leadership summit carried a kind of irony so thick it was almost funny. The same old prejudice polished up and applauded as wisdom. A part of me wanted to stand, to say aloud, if you get to define deserving, then the rest of us lost before the game even started. But I didn't. I stayed silent, letting my stillness become the one thing in this room no one could control. Because sometimes, the sharpest reply isn't cutting in. It's letting them talk themselves into a corner, letting the cracks show while they're too busy celebrating themselves to notice. I watched the crowd. Some clapped too hard, desperate to be seen on the right side. Others clapped lightly, eyes down, unwilling but afraid not to join in. Like always, the crowd chose safety over sense. I didn't clap. I didn't nod. I just sat there, my eyes telling a story they couldn't. The story of someone excluded, erased even, but sitting tall, unbowed. And in that moment, I felt something sweet and sharp all at once. They thought his words diminished me, but really they only exposed how small their vision was. The applause roared on, the speaker marching confidently into his opening lines. I listened, not to learn but to remember. Because one day soon, these same words would come back to haunt him, proof of how far behind the world he really was. Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes silence is just the pause before the backlash. When his speech reached its first big crescendo, the room thundered again with applause. I stayed seated, a faint smile at my lips. Let them cheer a little louder. The higher the volume today, the harder the crash will hit tomorrow. The clapping pounded the air like a storm against sheet metal. But I wasn't just hearing the noise, I was hearing the message beneath it. It wasn't just applause for him, it was a chorus aimed at me. You don't belong here. I felt the glances sweep over me, quick, sharp, enough to brand me without words. Outsider. Some eyes darted away like I was a stain they didn't want to see. Others lingered longer, deliberate, letting the contempt carry fully across the space between us. I met their eyes, steady, unflinching, turning my gaze into a mirror. A mirror showing them what they didn't want to admit. This exclusion wasn't confidence. It was fear, dressed up as certainty. And I wondered, if deserving is decided by one man on a stage, then what exactly are the hundreds of people clapping out there cheering for? Truth or just the same old power wearing a new suit? I tilted my head, smiling faintly. The word deserving sounded so familiar. It was the same tune I'd heard since I was a kid. You're not good enough to be chosen, not safe enough to be trusted, not like us enough to be invited in. Today, the same song was playing, just with fancier lyrics set to the soundtrack of leadership philosophy. A woman in front of me turned slightly, eyes sweeping me from head to toe. Measuring. Was my suit the right standard? Was my skin too out of place? Did my presence cost her the prestige of the room? Then she turned back, clapping along, as if she'd just signed off on a checklist. I almost laughed out loud. If anyone recorded this, they'd think I was watching an auction, where human worth was decided by glances, not skill or intellect. But I didn't laugh. I kept the smile small, private. Because I knew this. The louder the applause today, the more obvious the collapse tomorrow. They were clapping for their own blindness, too busy cheering to notice the ground cracking under them. I sat still, hands folded, silent against the noise. Silence isn't weakness. It's like a single black ink stain on a white tablecloth. The cleaner the surface, the more it stands out. Let them stare. Let them whisper, "I don't belong." Because the truth is, the moment they label you an outsider, they put you outside their frame. And from outside the frame, you see the whole picture. The applause finally ebbed, echoes bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. I drew in a deep breath, eyes fixed on the stage. And I made myself a quiet promise. They're applauding their own downfall. I won't fight for a seat in this room. I'll build a stage so big, their own audience will leave them for it. I exhaled slowly, letting it stay in my chest instead of out in the open. A faint smile curved my lips, small enough to go unnoticed, sharp enough to cut inside me like a blade. So this was it. Exclusion, dressed up as inspiration, rejection, masquerading as leadership. I looked at the man on stage, his voice booming, polished, dripping with experience. His words fell like drops of honey, but I could taste the bitterness underneath. He spoke of deserving, but never of justice. He praised leaders, but revealed the poverty of his own imagination. Only one skin tone, one accent, one mold of power allowed to exist. I watched the crowd. Some nodded along, hypnotized, drinking his words like wine. But here and there I caught drifting eyes, furrowed brows. Small signs, but enough. Not everyone was buying it. Some saw through the sugarcoating. They just weren't brave enough to say it yet. In my head, a thought rose up. Dry, ironic. If exclusion comes in a gift box, they'll call it opportunity. If condescension gets engraved on a plaque, they'll call it standards, and the whole room will rise to applaud the hypocrisy. I thought of my early days pitching for startup funding. Door after door slammed shut. They'd smile, shake my hand, and say, "Great idea, but we need someone more trustworthy on the paperwork." Trustworthy in their language meant not me. Tonight's speech was just the deluxe edition of the same rejection I'd heard my whole life. I smiled again, this time not for me, but for them. A silent reminder, I see you, and I'm not going to forget any of this. I didn't need to fight back yet. Retaliation doesn't always happen in the moment. Sometimes the best revenge is to turn their insult into fuel, their exclusion into the staircase you climb above them. And when you look down from the top, the same people who once locked you out will have to see what you built without them. The man on stage kept talking, voice booming like he was writing commandments into history. I listened, not to believe, but to store it all away. Because I knew soon these same words would stand as proof of how outdated this whole charade really was. I sat straighter. The weight in my chest was gone now. In its place, something harder, more certain. Let them write me out tonight. Tomorrow, I'd be writing the headline they couldn't control. Not just for me. For everyone who's ever sat in a chair like this, labeled the exception, the outsider, the not enough. One day soon, we wouldn't be in the audience anymore. We'd be building the stage. And when we did, they'd be the ones begging for a seat. I sat there, faint smile lingering, thinking, let them believe their sweet-sounding philosophy a little longer. They have no idea. In just a few hours, their audience will be on its feet, walking toward me. I sat there, steadying my breath after the flurry of applause. And then, when the panelists' names were read, one name made me almost laugh. Not because I was surprised, because it was too on the nose. He walked out, tall, shoulders squared, wearing a smile I knew too well. The same smile I'd seen on late nights after long meetings, when we'd sit together and share the dream that one day we'd both be on a stage like this, standing shoulder to shoulder with the biggest names. He used to call me brother more than once. Brother, we're not letting anyone sideline us. Brother, one day they'll have to listen. And today, that same brother strode straight onto the stage, past the exact chair that was meant for me, and sat down like it had always been his. The room clapped again, but this time it didn't sound like rain. It clanged like steel on steel, cold, biting. I watched him settle in, adjust the mic, pride stretching his smile taut. And I wondered, in the moment he sat, did he remember whose chair that was supposed to be? Memories flashed. The day we were both rejected from our first project. The way he gripped my shoulder and said, "We're on the same side." The cheap dinners, the belief that someday we'd share a table that wasn't plastic and shaky. Well, the table's set now. The chairs are placed. Only difference is, the one meant for me became the trophy of the man who once called me brother. I smiled. Thin, sour. People warn you about enemies disguised as friends. They don't warn you that sometimes friends become enemies, over a chair. I didn't stand, I didn't shout. I let my eyes follow him. If he glanced down, he'd see me smiling. But it wouldn't be support. It would be the smile of someone who knows the knife in your back usually doesn't come from a distance. It comes from the place you felt safest. The room cheered as he began. The words were familiar. Vision, opportunity, future. I heard each one, but over them I heard something else. Brother, we're not letting anyone sideline us? I wondered if he could hear his own promise betraying itself. I folded my arms, leaned back. In the quiet I kept for myself, I felt a new kind of strength. Because this betrayal didn't break me, it proved something. Even those closest to you can be seduced by the lights. If I want to last, I can't lean on anyone. I drew in a long breath, letting the sting harden into steel. Then I told myself, today you can sit in that chair. Tomorrow, I'm building a table. And when I do, you'll have to prove you belong there. He adjusted his tie, smiled at the crowd like everything was exactly where it belonged. But I knew that smile. It wasn't confidence. It was stretched tight, one snapped thread from coming apart. To the room, that smile was success. To me, it was a cold blade turning quietly under my rib. He didn't look down. Not once. I'm sure he avoided it on purpose. One glance and the ghost of brother would rise up, reminding him the seat wasn't truly his. So he chose not to see me at all. The safest move to protect the mask he was wearing. I watched. Every gesture was smooth, but beneath the polish, I could hear the muffled sound of betrayal. It wasn't loud, not showy. It was a stiletto hidden under a pressed lapel. I thought about those late nights, splitting a cheap loaf and a huge belief. He once said, "Dorian, one day they won't dare overlook us." Tonight he sat there, basking in the spotlight. And I understood, promises don't always vanish. Sometimes they get sold, traded in for a chair. The audience applauded as his talk hit its stride. I listened, not to absorb, but to measure. The lines about vision, leadership, unity rolled out like practiced slogans. And there it was, the bitter comedy. He was using the same words we once built together, rerouted now to keep the applause focused squarely on him. I didn't get angry. I smiled, cool and thin. They can take the chair. They can even take the words. They can't take the story I'm writing. And this story, whether they acknowledge it or not, is already moving in ways they can't control. I tilted my chin toward the stage. To everyone else, he was shining. To me, he was clinging to a light that was never his. Because this chair, this spot, was given to me. And when the truth surfaces, he'll have to answer one question. Did you deserve it, or just slip into it? A small laugh surfaced inside me, enough to let me breathe easier. The funny part isn't that he took the seat. The funny part is he thinks he won. By pretending not to see me. By dodging the truth seated right below him. What kind of victory can't meet its brother's eyes? I straightened, calm. A chair doesn't define real worth, but the way a person takes it, through betrayal, pretense, and a tightened smile, that reveals everything. I reminded myself, you can look away today, but when the new table stands, you won't be able to look me in the eye. From the floor, I watched him perform, line after line designed to crown himself. Heads nodded, Hands clapped on cue, and I sat still, my smile a thin cut. Then I understood. The worst betrayal isn't from a stranger. It's from the hand that once rested on your shoulder. When a stranger shuts you out, you call it bias, ignorance, prejudice. When someone who once stood beside you takes the exact place you were meant to fill, the wound shifts. It's no longer simple exclusion. It's a message. Brotherhood, loyalty. Everything's negotiable as long as the price is a bright chair. I remembered those hands, clenching my shoulder after a loss. Brother, they won't see us as outsiders anymore. We'll prove it. I still hear that sentence, but now it echoes hollow. Because the brother on that stage pretends not to see me, as if erasing our history could make it untrue. I wasn't furious the way they'd expect. I didn't want to leap up and expose him. That would only hand him a victim's mask and make me the disruption they already think I am. I chose silence, the loudest indictment. Everyone knows silence in the face of betrayal isn't blindness. It's clarity. It's choosing to let the truth unveil the betrayer by itself. I looked at him and a dry laugh rose in my chest. What's funny? That a man can sit in a chair meant for the person he called brother and still can't lift his eyes? A gold-plated chair is just an empty shell when it's taken by treachery. I told myself, this doesn't weaken me. It teaches me. No one but me can guard my place, and if I must, I won't just guard a seat. I'll build a table and invite the ones like me who've been shut out. That table will be wider, stronger, and no one will have to trade loyalty to claim a place. He wrapped up. The room erupted. I stayed still, a single low note under their orchestra. Let them clap the polished lines. I'm preparing the real performance. It won't need a mic or lights. It will need the truth, and truth doesn't flicker. I nodded, like accepting a hard lesson. But really, it was a promise to myself. This betrayal won't put me out. It's kindling. I'll build what they don't even dare to imagine. I sat there, a cold smile on my lips, thinking, if a single chair can make a brother break faith, how many faces will show their true selves when I raise a table? After everything that had just happened, I decided I wasn't going to sit still anymore. I stood, left the lower rows, and walked straight to the organizers area. Not to make a scene, I just wanted a clear explanation. The reception desk sat in the hallway corner, tucked behind a red velvet drape. A few staffers hovered over their laptops, whispering, eyes darting like they were shielding a script. I stepped up, the invitation still in my pocket, heavy as evidence that couldn't be erased. Excuse me, I said, calm but firm. My name was submitted for the panel. I'd like to know why it disappeared. A slight man in his 50s with thick glasses looked up. He glanced at me, then switched to that familiar corporate tone. Ah, yes, Mr. Hayes. We did see your name, but there were some last-minute adjustments. We thought it would be better if you participated from the audience. I frowned. From the audience? He nodded, twirling a pen to avoid my eyes. Yes, this is also an opportunity. From below, you can observe, learn from the faces we've selected. I let out a small laugh. Learn. I've led a company from a wobbly wooden desk to 100 employees. I've stood on stages, signed contracts they know nothing about. And today I'm advised to sit in the cheap seats and learn. For a split second, I saw a black kid at the back of a classroom, the one whose raised hand never got called on. They called it building humility. I knew it for what it was, a polite way to say, your place is not here. I held his gaze, my smile thin. You think I need a lesson from the back row? He shrugged, his grin stretched tight with courtesy. We can all learn more, can't we? Sugar-coated words, bitter aftertaste. Humiliation wrapped in nice language cuts deeper. I didn't argue. I let the silence lengthen until he dropped his eyes and pretended to shuffle papers. Then I turned and walked back toward the hall. The anger didn't flare, it cooled into steel. I reminded myself, losing a chair doesn't make me smaller. Sitting in the audience will only make my return louder. He looked up again with that pasted-on smile, the kind people use to launder insult into kindness. You can sit in, learn more. It's an opportunity. For a moment, the building seemed to tilt. I heard that line and it felt like the entire hall was smirking, not out loud, but in every glance, every half-hidden frown. Me, a CEO, someone who's failed and rebuilt enough times to build a company from scratch. recast as a student in the cheap seats with a notebook, learning from professional seat holders. I didn't answer right away. I looked straight through those thick lenses. His eyes skittered. He knew this wasn't logistics. It was a polite shove. I nodded, a smile just big enough to mask the acid. An opportunity, I repeated. I've heard that word all my life. When I lost a scholarship, an opportunity to build resilience. When a bank rejected a loan, an opportunity to prove your financials. Today, shoved off a leadership panel, an opportunity to learn from below. Funny how every exclusion arrives gift-wrapped as opportunity. The creativity is so thin. But the smile wasn't entirely fake. They'd handed me something more valuable than a chair, a reason to build a table. And from that table, my voice will travel farther than any mic in this room. I glanced around. Other staffers were watching, wearing the quiet arrogance of people sure there'd be no pushback. To them, I was a fussy guest receiving a lesson in humility. I leaned in just enough for only him to hear, sharp enough to nick the veneer. You know, the folks you sit in the audience today? Often they're the ones you'll be chasing tomorrow for a seat. His face tightened, then reset to the same polite smile. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The seed was planted. I straightened my jacket as if accepting their learning opportunity. Inside, I told myself, enjoy this moment. The opportunity you just gifted me, Mas, is the reason this entire room will tilt. I didn't argue further. I let his words drop into the quiet until they echoed back as a warped bell. I swallowed my silence. Not agreement, but strategy. Some lines don't need a rebuttal. Truth has a way of surfacing, and when it does, no glossy smile can cover it. Back in the hall, the rows of seats waited like they'd been assigned. I sat back straight, chin up. To make it plain, I wasn't bowing to demotion. I carved in something harder than anger. My value isn't set by their definitions, seats, or lists. It's forged in every exclusion I've outlasted, every scar of silence I've turned into armor. I scanned the faces, pleased expression, synchronized applause. The more I looked, the clearer it was. Consensus isn't truth. Many clap not from belief, but from fear. Fear of becoming the exception if they don't. This world is full of people afraid to stand alone. I'm not one of them anymore. A thought crossed my mind, dry and sharp. They should rewrite the conference rules. Rule 1. If you're not selected, sit quietly below and pretend to learn. Rule 2. Call humiliation opportunity. Rule 3. Never let the truth in. It ruins the party. I chuckled under my breath. Because right now I knew my leverage. I don't need their approval to have value. Their refusal handed me a new role. The one outside the frame, watching the whole play from an angle they'll never have. I inhaled, let the quiet thread itself through me, and turned it into a vow. I don't need that chair to prove anything. I'll build a table where no one gets to mute my voice. No red carpets, no nameplates, no permission slips. Just truth, and people brave enough to hear it. I sat below, but inside I stood. They thought they'd demote me to a student. In this moment, I became my own teacher. The lesson I wrote in silence. Real worth isn't in what you're handed. It's in the seat you build for yourself. The stage lights kept bathing the anointed. But inside that glow, I saw a second truth. They're only holding chairs. I'm preparing a hall. I stayed still, eyes on the stage, smiling once more as I thought, they call this my chance to learn. They don't realize the only lesson I'm taking home is how to turn humiliation into an invitation to build an entirely new game. I left the organizer's table and returned to the hall. I hadn't even sat down when a man appeared. Notebook in one hand, pen clipped across the top. The posture of someone who lived for quotable lines to turn into tomorrow's headlines. His eyes scanned me head to toe, openly curious, with just a hint of smug delight. "Mr. Hayes," he began, his tone dragging out the words as if preparing for a primetime interview. "What are your thoughts on the fact that not everyone has what it takes to sit in a leadership chair?" The question hit like a stone skidding across marble, cold, sharp, deliberate. I looked at him, held his gaze in silence long enough to let the smile on his face falter. He wanted me flustered, defensive, something he could twist into a headline by morning. I knew his type. I'd seen him at countless events. They weren't after truth, they were after titles. And titles always required a punchline. Today, they thought that punchline was me. I leaned back slightly, exhaled slowly. Part of me wanted to laugh. Not everyone has what it takes. How ironic, coming from someone in a room where those chairs were filled not by merit, but by lineage and privilege. If what it takes meant the right skin tone, the right family tree, then sure, I didn't have it. But if it meant surviving rejection, building something out of nothing, getting back up every single time the door slammed, then I had more than enough. I kept my silence a few beats longer, because sometimes the pause is the answer. Then I smiled, a small thin smile, half amused, half steady. You know, I said slowly, your question's an interesting one. It reminds me of all the times I was told I wasn't enough. Not enough experience, not enough resources, not the right face, and every single time I built something they didn't see coming. Maybe the issue isn't about capacity. Maybe they're just afraid of seeing a face that doesn't look like theirs sitting at that table. His pen froze midair. A few people nearby turned their heads toward us, waiting to hear what would come next. I tilted my head, voice dropping low, calm but edged. Or maybe let's be honest. Maybe what they want is a leadership table made entirely of mirrors. If that's the case, then yes, you're right. I don't have what it takes to be a mirror. Somebody nearby stifled a laugh. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the tight air. The reporter blinked, faltered, then forced a weak chuckle of his own, pretending his question hadn't just backfired. I said nothing else. My silence carried the rest. He wanted a headline. What he got instead was a mirror held up to his own script. I sat back, eyes drifting toward the stage as if the entire exchange hadn't mattered. Inside, though, there was a calm certainty. They could mock, they could diminish, but every loaded question only exposed them, not me. His words still rang in my head, metal cold. Not everyone has what it takes to sit in a leadership chair. I heard the contempt underneath, aimed not just at me, but at everyone like me. People told their place was always outside the door, always serving, always learning, never leading. I sat tall, eyes locked on him so he could see I understood the game. This wasn't a question. This was a pre-written verdict, read out loud so the room could nod along. I remembered all the times I'd heard this verdict before. In school, when I was cut from the debate team despite top scores because I lacked maturity. At my first job interview, when they said, "You don't quite have the right image for the company." Different words, same meaning, not enough, not one of us. And now here it was again, dressed up in journalistic neutrality. People say the press reports reality. Sometimes they don't just report it, they manufacture it. They script it, cast it, then shove you into the role they've already written. Today, the role they picked for me was the outsider. The proof that, as he put it, not everyone has what it takes. I smiled, not wide, just enough to taste the salt on my lips. It struck me how often they wrapped exclusion in pretty words. Not enough sounds harsher than not the right fit. Not the right fit sounds colder than not the right image. But not everyone has what it takes. Ah, that one sparkled, didn't it? It sounded like wisdom while carrying the same old poison. I leaned in slightly, eyes on him, letting the silence stretch. He needed to see that I understood the game. I didn't need to shout. Because the truth was, his question didn't shrink me, it revealed him. And the system standing behind him. In that moment, I thought of all the others like me, scattered far beyond this room. People who'd heard their own verdicts in classrooms, in offices, in interviews. I wanted them to know this wasn't just about one chair. Every time someone asks that question, they're speaking to all of us. And that's exactly why our answers have to outlive them. I nodded slightly, like I'd just heard a court ruling I found amusing rather than binding. Then I said, slowly, each word dropping like a pebble on marble, "Interesting you call it not having what it takes, because if you look closely, you might realize the real limitation here. Belongs to your question, not to me." His eyes jerked. The pen stopped again. I didn't give him more. I sat back, voice calm, almost casual. "Oh, do we need a license for the right skin tone now?" The room paused, frozen mid-breath. Then, from somewhere off to the side, a laugh cracked through. Not a loud laugh, just sharp enough to make a few more follow. Some people smothered theirs. Others let it out, half nervous, half relieved, like they'd been waiting for someone to say it all along. The reporter stiffened, his ready-made smile collapsing at the edges. His hand trembled slightly over the notebook, like he wasn't sure whether writing that line down would burn the page. Because if it made it to print, it wouldn't read like a joke. It would read like an indictment. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. There was no anger left in me, just a clean, sharp irony. The bitterest part wasn't his question. It was the fact that this entire room had lived so long with questions like his that they thought it was normal. Only when I pushed back, calmly, almost lazily, did they flinch at the taste of their own words. I looked around. Some eyes flicked to me, then away. Others held on, uneasy, unsure whether to be irritated or impressed. They didn't know what box to put me in. I wasn't clapping along, wasn't bowing my head, but I also wasn't shouting. I answered like the truth was too obvious to require force. That unsettled them more than anger ever could. For a moment, I thought about everyone outside this hall, people grinding through their days under the same polite exclusions, the same unspoken rules. I wanted them to hear this answer, to know they didn't have to shrink themselves just because someone handed them a smaller frame. That they could ask back calmly, plainly, "Who decided we need your permission to exist?" The reporter cleared his throat, fumbling for composure. He mumbled a few words, then stepped back like a man who'd just touched fire thinking it was harmless wax. I said nothing more. I let the silence sit heavy so we could feel every ounce of it. Around the room, the air still carried the tremor of that line. The laughter had faded, but its echo lingered in people's eyes. Some would go home tonight and say, "I heard a response today I'll never forget." I stayed seated, shoulders loose, strangely certain. Because I knew, a moment this small had just lodged a thorn in their polished mask, and that thorn wasn't coming out anytime soon. I smiled faintly, eyes on the stage again, thinking, if one offhand line can rattle this room, imagine what happens when I build a stage of my own. I walked out of the main hall, the applause still echoing behind me like an orchestra stuck on the same old refrain. Each clap felt like a declaration that the chair up there was bolted down, that the rules were already written. But I know every rule has a loophole. Theirs is called complacency. I followed the hotel's long corridor, warm yellow light pooling under each step. At the end, a small sign led breakout room capacity 30. Usually a tucked-away space, no glittering chandeliers, no plush red carpet, just white walls, a few wooden chairs, and harsh neon lights. To most, it's an afterthought. To me, it was the starting line. I stopped at the door. The hotel manager appeared, surprised when I asked to rent it on the spot. "Are you sure?" he said, as if he couldn't believe someone in a pressed suit would pick this over the grand hall. I nodded. "I don't need chandeliers, I said. I just need a few chairs and an open door." A few minutes later, the small room opened up in front of me. It was quiet, the old paint smell lingering, neon white casting every crack in the walls into sharp relief. But to me, it shone brighter than the ballroom. Here, I didn't need anyone to grant me a seat. I could set out as many as I wanted. I arranged the wooden chairs in a small arc. Every scrape against the floor sounded like a statement. I'm building a counter stage, no mics, no LED screens, just the truth, and a voice strong enough to fill a small room. I sat in the first chair and pictured the people who'd leave the main hall and walk in here. They wouldn't find red carpets or fine wine, but they'd find something rarer, honesty. I'd tell them what won't be said on that other stage, not hollow slogans, but things that sear the skin, failures and hard falls nobody likes to admit. A quiet laugh rose up in me. The irony, they tried to push me down into the audience, but that shove delivered me to a room where I don't need permission to speak. They thought removing me would lock the door. They didn't realize that by closing that one, they'd open this one. A small, humble door leading to a space nobody controls. I stood and walked the room, palm on the white wall. It was cold and rough, the opposite of the ballroom's gloss. But in that roughness, I felt strength. No pretense, no need to hide the flaws. That's the energy I wanted for this stage, truth. Bare, but proud. When the door clicked shut behind me, I knew I'd done something the organizers never imagined. I hadn't accepted the role of spectator. I'd made myself the host. And no matter how big their hall was, it couldn't stop feet from walking out and coming here. I'd just finished lining up the chairs when a few hotel staff passed by. They peeked into the neon-lit room and snickered. One whispered, loud enough for me to hear, "Who's leaving the main panel for this?" His voice held pity and mockery, as if I'd made myself the punchline. I looked up and smiled at them. No arguing, no explaining. Mockery needs a reaction to survive. If I don't feed it, it starves. I sat in the center chair and looked around the empty room. The neon light washed over the walls, exposing every crack and flake of paint. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And truth, even rough-edged, is stronger than the polished speeches next door. Their laughter lingered in the hallway. I let it drift in, then smiled to myself. Who would abandon the main hall for this little room? The question sounded like a verdict, but to me it was a prediction. History rarely gets written in the busiest room. It begins in small spaces where someone dares to tell a different truth. I remembered the early days of my company. They laughed then, too. Who's going to invest in a young black guy with nothing but a scribbled business plan? They laughed, then later elbowed their way in to buy shares. Laughter has never slowed me down. It only makes the road more interesting. Another staffer paused, peered in, and half-joked, "Waiting on somebody?" I nodded. "I'm waiting for people brave enough to leave the lies outside." He blinked, unsure whether to laugh or not, and moved on. I stayed, alone in the pale light. Solitude didn't discourage me. It felt like the stillness before a wave. I knew if even one person walked through that door, everything would change. And I believed that out there in the crowd were people tired of empty rhetoric, ears hungry for something real. Applause rolled from the main hall, loud as rain on glass. To me, it sounded like the thrashing of an old beast, desperate to prove it still had power. I told myself, let them clap a little longer. When audiences finally realize that banquet is reheated leftovers, they'll look for a room serving something fresh. Arms folded, I closed my eyes for a few seconds and pictured the door swinging open. Faces unsure but curious. Steps hesitant, then committed. I knew when that happened, the hallway laughter would curdle into a heavy silence. I opened my eyes and looked at the empty chairs. They weren't an embarrassment. They were an invitation. One for anyone brave enough to step away from the crowd to find the truth. I sat quietly, the small room still, just the washed-out glow of the neon above me. Plenty of chairs, no people yet. The earlier snickers seemed to haunt the corridor. I wasn't impatient. I've long been the first person to sit at an empty table. Then the door swung open. A middle-aged man stepped in, breathing a little hard, as if he'd just escaped a staged performance. He looked around, hesitant, then settled his eyes on me. "You planning to speak in here?" he asked, unsure if he was making a mistake. I smiled. "If you want the truth, sit down." He pulled a chair. The wood scraped the floor, echoing in the space. That single scrape opened the change. Within minutes, a young couple appeared, confused, curious. They sat, whispering, "Out there, it's the same lines," over and over. I didn't interrupt, just nodded so they knew they'd chosen right. More footsteps. More chairs dragged out. The scrape of wood on tile became a refrain. The room filled with breath, with eyes, and, most importantly, with expectancy. I stood. No mic, no podium, just my voice. "I don't have a rallying cry," I said. "I have the truth, and the truth doesn't need a permit to be heard." Silence settled. Complete. No one shifted. They'd come because they were sick of the fake ovations, and now they wanted what no one dared to say. The door kept opening. Small clusters slipped in. The empty spaces vanished. People squeezed in for chairs, some stood along the wall. From a handful of scattered seats, the room swelled into a tight block of people. The ones who laughed in the hall earlier were gone, no longer willing to poke their heads in. They understood their laughter had been swallowed by the quiet resolve inside this room. I took it in and saw the irony, clear as day. The grand hall with the chandeliers was thinning out, while this surplus room, bright with tired neon, was packed. Truth never needed a red carpet. It only needed a place to sound. I went on, steady and measured, loud enough to reach everyone. They said I didn't have what it takes to sit in a leadership chair. But look around. What it takes isn't in a chair. It's in who's willing to stand up, walk over here, and sit down with me. Nods appeared, small at first, then spreading like a wave. I watched eyes light up, not for me, but for themselves. Because they just had the courage to leave the crowd and enter a room they'd been told was beneath them. Out in the corridor, the main hall applause still leaked through, distant and hollow. In here, the silence was heavy as stone, consensus without applause. I smiled at the rows now full and thought, they asked who would leave the main panel for this room. The answer's right here, one by one, until no chairs are left. I looked around the packed space and wondered, when these wooden seats are hotter than the gilded ones outside, who exactly has been left behind? On the other side of the hotel, the main hall was still blazing with light. TV cameras swept the room, ready to capture leadership moments to convince the outside world this was where wisdom gathered. But cameras don't lie. They panned across the rows, and what showed up on screen wasn't the script the organizers had dreamed of. Seats that had once been packed with pricey invitations were now patchy and bare, the hall looking like a painting with chunks torn out. Empty chairs couldn't be hidden, no matter how the operators tried to crop their frames. The lens drifted over the faces that remained, and that's where the irony sharpened. A woman in a crisp suit forced a smile while sitting between two empty seats. Her nodding was so excessive it felt like she was nodding at her own embarrassment. A man with a blazing red tie fiddled with his phone, eyes darting when he realized he was in the shot. Elsewhere, a few people bowed their heads and pretended to take notes, busy work to dodge the camera catching their discomfort. I could picture the organizers backstage signaling the crew, "Don't show the gaps!" But the emptiness was everywhere. The harder they tried to hide it, the more the camera revealed it. That's the bitter comedy life loves. The more you cover, the more you expose. Meanwhile, in the small room where I stood, every wooden chair was taken. People lined the walls shoulder to shoulder. Some sat on the floor just to listen. No cameras here, but if there were, the image would be the perfect inverse. A plain room under cold neon light, yet packed with focus, overflowing with the one thing the grand hall lacked most: truth. I smiled to myself, half bitter, half satisfied. It felt like a Stephen Chow scene. The one pushed to the margins suddenly becomes the center, while the ones so sure of their prestige huddle, ringed by empty gold seats. If this were a film, the director would lay in some goofy, biting cue music, jaunty notes over shots of vacant rows and stiff, awkward smiles. That's the power of satire. It doesn't need a whistleblower. It just needs a lens to glide by, and the truth strips itself bare. I wasn't in the main hall, but I knew exactly what was happening. Word would spread fast. People would ask, why was the leadership summit half empty? The answer was here in this small room where the wooden seats were hotter than the gilded ones. I smiled and thought, absence speaks louder than presence. Today, those empty chairs did the talking for me. While the cameras out there tried to dodge the gaps, my room grew close with bodies. People squeezed into chairs, latecomers hugged the walls, a few sat on the cold tile. No one complained. The tension hummed tight as a string, every eye fixed on me. I started, no mic, no glittering lights. My voice was steady, bare, and somehow weighty in its bareness. Nothing I said was a slogan. It was lived life, scar tissue, tuition paid in failures, and getting back up. They say we lack stature, I said, scanning the faces, but they've never learned what real stature is. It isn't a gilded chair. It's the nerve it takes to walk into this room, where nobody promises you status, just the truth. Silence cracked into thunder. Applause slammed the walls and ricocheted until it felt bigger than the space itself. In that exact moment, I swear I heard it punch through the drywall, flood the hallway, and leak into the main hall. I pictured them hearing it, trying to stay focused on a dry keynote when a wave rolled in from the other side. Applause not on the run of show, not for broadcast, but so real it made shoulders stiffen. I laughed inside. Delicious irony. People use applause to prove power, but today the applause betrayed them. It bled through the walls and drew a line in sound. One side straining for grandeur with mics and lights, the other shaking the plaster with nothing but naked truth. A woman in the front row's eyes shimmered. "I've never heard this at any conference," she whispered. The person beside her nodded, palms still warm. In their faces, I saw more than agreement, relief, like they'd finally found somewhere to breathe. I kept going, not louder, just truer. Power isn't yelling over the other mic, it's carving each word deep enough to leave a mark. And every round of applause wasn't for me alone. It was for themselves, for their courage to step out of the crowd and into this chalky neon room. The clapping rose again, harder, longer, like a message shooting through the wall. I lifted my head and listened to it roll down the corridor. For a second, I imagined the organizers frowning in the other hall, whispering, "What's going on in that room?" I didn't need to declare victory. The hands in this room did it for me. Their sound was a wordless manifesto, and the farther it traveled, the clearer it revealed the truth. Gravity isn't where the spotlight is. It's where truth is spoken. The applause in my small room still bounced off the walls when the door burst again. One person, then two, then a whole group. They looked around, then wedged themselves along the wall. The chairs were long gone. In their eyes, I saw bewilderment. Not at the plain space, but at the realization dawning on them. The truth lived here now, not on the stage they'd left. Back in the main hall, it slipped into farce. People later said the organizers panicked as the empty patches spread. The speaker kept droning, but rows peeled away. The gilded chairs, once symbols of status, became exhibits of abandonment. I pictured the cameras trying to cope. The host raising his volume to drown the void. A few holdouts forcing polite smiles and perfunctory claps. Staff hustling in the aisles whispering, "Where did everyone go?" A clumsy comedy, unaware it was being filmed. As for me, I didn't need to cross the hall to confront anyone. I stood in this room and spoke in my normal voice while satire wrote itself outside. The ones who cut me out were the ones now being cut loose. A clean inversion, needing no victory speech. I remembered the check-in desk, the thin laughs, the line, "You can sit in the audience and learn." And now those perched up high, lecturing about stature, were learning a lesson no syllabus covers. You can't force an audience to sit through a performance built on pretense. In this small room, I didn't chant, didn't brand, didn't craft a slogan. I talked about the road, every rejection, every slight, and how I turned them into steps. Heads nodded, a few eyes brimmed, not for me, but because they recognized themselves. Each burst of clapping rose with no cue light, no stage manager, just hearts answering back. I laughed quietly, Chow style, funny, bleak, and sharp at once. If someone wrote this scene, they might title it "The Lesson of the Chairs." Because the chair that once meant power had become an empty trap, and the plain wooden ones had become the emblem of truth. I never had to step into the main hall to take them on. They heard the echo from here, and when they walked out, they'd know it wasn't me who'd been pushed aside. It was them who'd stepped away from the truth. I looked over the packed room and smiled to myself. This was satire in its purest form. I didn't have to proclaim a thing because the abandonment over there had already delivered the sharpest statement about our statement of all. I stood before a packed room, every wooden chair taken. People lined the walls, crowded the doorway. A few even sat on the floor, never mind the tailored suits and polished shoes. The white neon light washed over us, catching every wrinkle, every bead of sweat, every look. And every one of those looks was on me. I drew a long breath. In that moment, I didn't need to say a word. The silence was loud enough. The silence of dozens who'd left a glittering hall to squeeze into this small room. It condensed into a single block of energy and hit me square in the chest. I took in each face. Some young, eyes bright with hunger, some older, a faint smile that seemed to say, finally, something real. Some still hesitant, as if they couldn't quite believe they'd abandoned a gilded seat to be here. They were all waiting, not for a keynote, but to witness the truth said out loud. I let the quiet stretch so everyone could feel its weight. And in that quiet, I realized something strange. Real power isn't in your voice. It's in your ability to make a whole room hold its breath until you use it. A man in the front row, shirt wrinkled from fighting his way out of the main hall, gave me a small nod. It felt like a nudge forward. I smiled back, but I still didn't speak. Sometimes the waiting is the lesson. The only sound was an old fan turning slow, its blades squeaking in time with the quickened heartbeats of the people listening. It felt like I was holding an invisible instrument. One touch, and the whole room would hum. Finally, I spoke, low, clear. We're here not because this room is prettier than the one next door. We're here because truth can ring anywhere, whether it's a narrow wooden box of a room or a gold-plated hall. And today, truth chose this place. No applause at first. A small, necessary pause, as if the words needed space to sink in. Then the room erupted. Clapping, cheers, palms slapping the backs of wooden chairs until the walls shook. I laughed to myself. The irony was rich. The organizers told me to sit in the audience and learn. And now the people who abandoned their seats out there were learning from a room they'd written off. No mic, no chandeliers, just a long enough silence to strip everything bare. I looked around and saw agreement that didn't need words. I understood this wasn't just my moment. It was for everyone who'd been forced quiet. My silence had turned into a shared voice, one no one could cut off. I didn't need to say, I won. Victory doesn't always want a speech. Sometimes the strongest proof is silence. And that silence was roaring over in the main hall, those patchy rows of empty chairs like holes that can't be patched. I heard the cameras kept changing angles, trying to avoid the gaps. But the more they dodged, the clearer it got. A speaker still going hard, arms windmilling to hold the room together, but the faces left were restless, glancing at watches, faking notes, stealing looks at the door. Between all that pretending, a different emptiness ballooned. Bigger than the chairs, bigger than the stage. I didn't need to prove that silence. It was doing the work, saying no one has to sit through a hollow performance when they know where the real thing is. Saying gilded chairs can't keep bodies when their souls want something else. More than anything, it was saying the people who cut me out were now being cut off by their own audience. In our small room, the clapping rose again, longer, louder, ricocheting off the walls to underline the contrast. Faces lit up, not because I'd said anything grand, but because they knew they were witnessing something real. Here they weren't props told to sit still. Here they were part of the story. I laughed again, quietly. What a perfect little twist. They pushed me out and told me to sit and learn. Now the folks on the high stage were learning an expensive lesson. The audience can leave. There's no harsher silence than talking to rows of empty chairs. I didn't need to march back into the main hall or reclaim the seat that was supposed to be mine. The vacancies over there had already done it. All I had to do was stand here, look at these crowded wooden chairs, hear the applause that mattered, and know some victories don't need a war cry. I thought of the early startup days when they dismissed me, said my company would go nowhere. I didn't argue. I kept building. A few years later, when they came asking to partner, my silence was answer enough. Today was the same. I didn't need another word. Those empty rows had spoken loud. I looked around and nodded to myself. This flip wasn't just for me. It was a message to anyone who's been shut out, told they're not big enough. The truth is, you don't need their seat. Build another table, and let the silence of their empty chairs prove the rest. The clapping in our room tapered off, but the heat stayed like coals under ash. I stood there and breathed, letting the quiet return. Not heavy like when I first walked into the summit, but sharp, luminous. A silence with teeth. I looked at the faces. Some solemn, some moved, some glassy-eyed, like they'd found something they lost long ago. I knew this wasn't just about me. It was about all the times we've been shouldered off the table, politely reminded we didn't belong, turned into spectators in our own stories. A small, cutting smile tugged at my mouth. Somewhere across the hotel, the people who pushed me away were probably trying to stuff those gaps with pretty words. But the more they said, the more they revealed. There isn't a sentence alive that can paper over the absence of an audience. I spoke again, slow and low. We all know that feeling, the one where you're moved off the table even with an invitation, even after you've done the work. They tell us to sit below and learn, but really they're just trying to keep a table full of matching faces. The room went still, not with fear, but with unity, hearts beating in unison. I took a few steps. The neon cast my shadow on the peeling wall. It didn't look shabby to me. It looked like the perfect backdrop, honest, unvarnished. I went on, But if there's no seat for us at that table, what do? We build another one. Bigger, longer, wider? A table where no one has the power to shut anyone out. A table where every chair is a true invitation. No begging, no proving. I stopped. I didn't need lights or a mic. I needed a pocket of quiet so the words could sink. Then I met each gaze, letting my eyes ask the question, hanging in the air. How many times will we be pushed from the table? And how many times will we answer by building one bigger, where no one gets to lock the door? A wave of silence swept the room. No one moved. But I knew the question had found its way in. It would walk out with them, thread into later conversations, live inside the choices they were about to make. Then, like a spring finally released, the room detonated in applause, louder than anything I'd heard at any official conference. It wasn't praise, it was a promise. I smiled, stayed put, and let the new noise wrap around me. Because I knew, silence can open a new chapter. And once that chapter starts, no guest list or gilded chair can smother the truth again. I nodded slowly at them and thought, this question won't fade. It's walking out that door with them. And after that, the world will have to answer for itself. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.